Last week we read excerpts from Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Now we turn to a short story written by her daughter, Mary Shelley. Shelley is most famous for her 1818 novel Frankenstein, and had we more time, I would have loved for us to read it together. The short story in her textbook, The Mortal Immortal, is a shorter, less complex work, but it does engage in some similar themes as Frankenstein, and serves as one of the earliest science fiction stories. In a quick summary, this story is about a man who becomes immortal and struggles with what a long life means when you lose the ones you love, and you can make no real human connections because you are now something more or less than human. Now, this story may also seem quite different from others we've read in its decentralization of women. Shelley's main character is a young man named Winsey. The only two female characters are his beloved Bertha and her strict and overbearing foster mother. And Bertha is no heroine. She's beautiful but vain and haughty, and she's prone to selfishness, jealousy, and unfaithfulness. And that's okay. As we progress into an era where more and more women are writing all kinds of different works across different genres, we're going to see a greater diversity of topics and characters that women take up. Women's literature does not have to be about women. It's just that much of what we've read so far has been, and often because it needed to be, for women to make room for themselves and their concerns and justify their existences as writers. We'll still study women writers engaging with women's issues, but we would cheapen a study of women's literature if we reduced it to always being focused only on women's experiences. We don't exclusively talk about literature written by men as being always about men. And likewise, women's stories can focus on men, have no women, or have unlikable women. Women writers can, like men, explore realms previously uncharted by other authors. They can write about any story that they want to tell. In fact, much of Shelley's work actually focuses on men, and her life was certainly full of fascinating male figures, from her father, philosopher William Godwin, to her poetic husband Percy Shelley and their friend Lord Byron. Her characters Victor Frankenstein and his creature continue to fascinate and are adapted over and over again in different mediums. And this is certainly proof that a woman can explore the psyche of a man and is not limited to writing only female main characters. Of course, women and maternity haunt the text of Frankenstein. The death of his mother is what drives Victor Frankenstein into his research, and he creates through a new kind of science. He essentially gives birth to a new kind of life. And of course, it goes terribly wrong. The Mortal Immortal is also a story about a new kind of life, about dangerous experimentation, and it too is perhaps haunted by loss. As the fantastic biographical essay in our textbook points out, Mary Shelley experienced an extraordinary amount of loss. Her mother died 10 days after Mary was born, and the longing for her mother and the desire and sometimes torment of living up to her legacy had a profound impact on Shelley. But that would not be the last of her losses by far. Mary fell in love and in a relationship with Percy Shelley, and they had a daughter together when she was just 17. It was a premature daughter, and she died just 2 weeks later. The next year, Mary's half-sister committed suicide, and in that same year she gave birth to another child to Percy Shelley, a boy named William, who would die just 3 years later of malaria. Before that, however, she had another girl, Clara, who only lived for a little over a year before dying of dysentery. Actually, she died just a few months before William. Now, Mary did have another boy who lived to adulthood, but she also suffered at least one miscarriage. Infant mortality rates were notoriously high in this time, as were fatality rates for mothers, with Mary, like her own mother, almost dying and giving birth. In 1822, after 6 years of marriage, Mary's husband Percy drowns tragically, He was just 29 and she was 25 at the time. 2 years later, their close friend Lord Byron died at a young age as well. Outliving loved ones becomes a theme in Shelley's work, as seen in The Mortal Immortal and one of her later novels, The Last Man. Shelley never remarried and lived until the age of 53. Not exactly the 323 years old that her character in The Mortal Immortal would have, but compared to many in the 19th century, it was a fairly ripe age. She died in the home of her grown son, Percy Florence Shelley, and his wife Jane. On the first anniversary of Mary Shelley's death, Percy and Jane opened her desk and discovered mementos that, in their own way, highlight a kind of life after death. They found locks of her dead children's hair, a notebook that both she and her husband Percy had written in, and a copy of Percy's poem Adonai, another copy of which he had with him when he drowned. And further still, it was written by Percy in tribute to their friend John Keats, who had also died tragically young. Now, within one of the pages of this poem, it was folded around two other curious objects: Percy's ashes and the remains of his heart, which Mary had kept. So it's no wonder then that life and death and life after the others you love have died, preoccupies so much of Shelley's work. The Mortal Immortal tells the story of Windsor, a young man who has lived for 323 years as a result of an experiment with a fictionalized version of a real scholar and alchemist named Cornelius Agrippa. While hesitant to work with Agrippa, who pursued experiments that stretched beyond the laws of God and science, Windsor agreed to be his assistant so that he could make enough money to ensure a marriage with his childhood sweetheart, Bertha, whose guardian felt that Windsor was too poor a match for her. Now, at some point in the story, as you will discover, Windsor and Bertha are on the outs, and suffering from a broken heart, Windsor drinks a potion of Agrippa's, not realizing it would give him eternal life. Windsor becomes a lonely wanderer, reminiscent of the lonely figure of Frankenstein's creature, and perhaps a representation of Mary Shelley herself, outliving so many people she loved, including the love of her life. What does that mean for one's humanity, if our love and our relationships are such a defining part of ourselves? Beyond the symbolic level, The Mortal Immortal is a relatively simple story, reminiscent at times of a fairy tale. But as Blake Linton Wilfong points out, this was an early science fiction story in its publication in 1833. And its inclusion of a real historical figure is rather interesting and might actually be a somewhat feminist allusion on Shelley's part that Mary Wollstonecraft would be quite proud of. Wilfong points out that a noteworthy feature of The Mortal Immortal is that one of its characters is a genuine historical figure. Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa von Nettensheim was a German lawyer, diplomat, teacher, physician, writer, theologian, and alchemist in the late 15th and early 16th century. He helped form a secret society of theosophists, and his magnum opus on occult philosophy was filled with superstitious nonsense. But Agrippa also rightfully satirized the poor state of existing science and the pretensions of the learned. He advocated women's rights and equality, and tangled with the Inquisition, boldly and persistently defending a woman accused of witchcraft. He failed, and he was forced to resign his position as a magistrate. Now, The Mortal Immortal exaggerates facts about the real Agrippa. He did not create a potion of immortality, and he did not, as far as we know, have an assistant named Windsor. But nonetheless, the story is clearly a work of science fiction. It portrays him not as a sorcerer, but a scientist who is experimenting. And so this is actually ties back into Frankenstein, in which Agrippa was also mentioned by Mary Shelley. So this is a figure that she clearly had some interest in, and what he might represent for her stories. Now, I'll let you read the story on your own to decide what you think of its plots and characters. What meanings do you see Shelley working to impart? How does the Mortal Immortal function as a short story? What influence might this story have had on later science fiction? What might the story have to say about love and social class, and perhaps more than anything, love and loss?